These are the stories that built your language, not grammar textbooks or dictionaries or any formal system of education. Myths, fairy tales, ancient folklore, whispered around fires 6,000 years ago. And they did not just entertain us. They literally shaped the words you are using right now, the way you construct meaning, and the invisible architecture of human communication itself. This is the definitive history of mythology and etymology, and by the end, you will never hear a sentence the same way again. Let's start with a number that might surprise you. Around 150,000 words in the English language trace their origins back to ancient Greek. That's not a small footnote. That's a foundational pillar of the language you and I are speaking right now. A staggering number of those words entered English not through science or philosophy, but through mythology. Think about the phrases you use every day without a second thought. When you call something an Achilles heel, you are invoking a 3,000-year-old Greek story about a mother dipping her infant son into the river Styx. She held him by his heel, leaving one vulnerable spot that would eventually kill him. When you warn someone not to open Pandora's box, you are referencing a myth about the first woman on Earth unleashing suffering into the world. A Herculean task, a Sisyphean struggle, the Midas touch, a Trojan horse. Every one of these expressions carries the DNA of ancient storytelling directly into modern conversation. But mythology didn't just give us colorful idioms. It shaped something far deeper. Ernst Cassirer, widely regarded as the last great Neo-Kantian philosopher, spent decades exploring this very question. In his landmark work, Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, published between 1923 and 1929, Cassirer argued that human beings are fundamentally symbolic animals. In his 1944 essay on man, he put it beautifully. He wrote that man lives in a symbolic universe, where language, myth, art, and religion are parts of this universe. They are the varied threads which weave the symbolic net, the tangled web of human experience. What Cassirer understood, and what many of us still overlook, is that mythology was not some primitive attempt at science. It was the original operating system for meaning-making. Before humans developed empirical methods, they had stories, and those stories did not just describe reality, they organized it. They gave names to fears, hopes, forces of nature, and moral truths. And once you name something, once you wrap it in narrative, it becomes transmissible. It becomes culture. Carl Jung would later expand on this insight with his theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious. Jung argued that certain mythological patterns appear across all human cultures because they emerge from universal psychological structures. The hero's journey, the wise old man, the great mother. These are not just recurring story elements. They are fundamental organizing principles of human experience. Here is where it gets fascinating. There is a concept in comparative mythology called semantic correlation. It describes a phenomenon where the name of a god and the name of a natural phenomenon become the same word. The god thunder and the phenomenon thunder share a name. The god sky and the sky above you share a name. In cultures where this principle operates, changes in the word for the deity cause changes in the common noun, and vice versa. Language and mythology were not separate systems. They were the same system, evolving together. And you can still see this fossilized in our calendar. 4 days of your week are named after Norse gods. Tuesday comes from Tyr, the god of war. Wednesday comes from Woden, also called Odin, the All-Father. Thursday comes from Thor, the god of thunder. Friday comes from Frigg, the goddess of marriage and fertility. These names entered English during the Viking Age over 1,000 years ago, and we still use them every single week, without realizing we are invoking an ancient pantheon. Now, let's talk about how old these stories really are, because the answer is almost incomprehensibly ancient. In 2016, folklorist Sara Graca da Silva and anthropologist Jamshid Teherani published a groundbreaking study in the Royal Society Open Science Journal. They applied phylogenetic analysis, the same method biologists use to trace evolutionary lineages, to 275 folk stories classified as tales of magic using the Arne-Thompson-Uther Index, the standard classification system developed from the work of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Their findings were remarkable. Beauty and the Beast and Rumpelstiltskin appear to have originated between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago. Jack and the Beanstalk was traced back over 5,000 years to the splitting of Eastern and Western Indo-European languages from their Proto-Indo-European ancestor. And the tale of the Smith and the Devil dates to the Bronze Age, roughly 6,000 years ago. 6,000 years. These stories are older than the written word. They survived entirely through oral tradition, passed mouth to ear across hundreds of generations. And this finding directly challenged scholars who had argued that fairy tales could not survive that long without written texts to anchor them. The phylogenetic evidence proved otherwise. These narratives were so deeply embedded in human communication that they persisted for millennia through speech alone. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist who revolutionized the study of mythology in the 20th century, would not have been surprised. In his 1955 paper, The Structural Study of Myth, Lévi-Strauss proposed that myths function exactly like language. Just as language can be broken into phonemes and morphemes, myths can be broken into what he called mythemes, fundamental units of meaning. His argument was profound. If even the most fantastic, seemingly chaotic mythical stories obey universal structural laws, then all human thought must obey universal laws. Mythology was not chaos. It was grammar. This structural approach to mythology would later influence Joseph Campbell's work on the monomyth, or hero's journey, the universal pattern Campbell identified across mythologies worldwide. Campbell showed that from Gilgamesh to Luke Skywalker, the same narrative template appears across cultures and centuries, suggesting these stories tap into something fundamental about human psychology and meaning-making. Roland Barthes took this idea in a different direction. In his 1957 book, Mythologies, Barthes argued that myth is a type of speech, returning to the original Greek meaning of mythos, which simply means word, speech, or story. But Barthes added a political edge. He showed that modern societies create myths too, not about gods and monsters, but about consumer products, national identity, and cultural norms. These modern myths perpetuate the ideologies of the ruling class. The mechanism is the same as it was thousands of years ago. Stories shape how we think, and whoever controls the stories controls the meaning. What ties all of this together is a simple but radical insight. Languages are far more complex than they need to be for basic one-to-one communication. You do not need a metaphor to say "pass the salt." You do not need narrative structure to warn someone about a predator. So why did human language evolve to be so extraordinarily rich and layered? The answer, according to researchers studying the evolution of language and mythology, is that language co-evolved with storytelling. Myth extended the limits of what verbal expression could accomplish. It pushed language to develop complexity, nuance, abstraction, and emotional resonance. Without mythology, we might communicate, but we would not communicate like humans. And this is not just a Western phenomenon. Across every culture on Earth, mythology and language are intertwined. In Hindu tradition, Vak is the goddess of speech itself, speech personified, with a cosmological role as the mother of the Vedas. In Yoruba tradition, the trickster god Eshu serves as a divine messenger who speaks all languages. In Norse mythology, the gift of speech was given to the first humans by Ve, the third son of Bor, alongside hearing and sight. Even the biblical story of Adam names language as the first divine gift, the tool by which humans apprehend and take possession of the world. Every culture understood intuitively what scholars have spent centuries trying to prove. Mythology is not decoration on top of language. It is the engine inside it. Today, computational methods borrowed from evolutionary biology are being applied to folklore studies, tracking how stories mutate across generations the same way genes do. Cultural evolution theory is examining how deeply entrenched fairy tales undergo small structural mutations over centuries. The field of linguistic anthropology treats language as a form of social action, exploring how communication creates and sustains cultural beliefs, relationships, and identities. The stories our ancestors told 6,000 years ago didn't just survive. They became the foundation of how we speak, how we think, and how we make sense of being alive. Every time you describe a challenge as Herculean, every time you call Wednesday by its name, every time you tell your children a bedtime story, you're participating in the oldest human technology there is. Not fire, not the wheel, story. And that's something worth remembering.